talk today focuses on the company SABA, which is a Norwegian company that was founded in the post-war period within Norway, and really was the first to commercialize successfully menstrual products like disposable pads and tampons in Norway and subsequently also Scandinavia. So during the mid-20th century, the so-called SABA bus, which was a bus branded with the slogan, was a frequent sight driving through rural Norway, evangelizing the good news of so-called modern menstrual hygiene by advertising the novel technology at the time of single-use disposable pads and later tampons. The SABA brand name refers to the biblical figure of the Queen of Sheba, which is called the Queen of Saba in Norwegian. So we have a kind of interesting religious link right at the top. It became the kind of fairy tale business story of the post-war and pre-oil economic landscape of Norway that the country still prides itself on, and monopolized the menstrual market completely, becoming the only brand available for consumers between 1940 and 1990. And it did this through the brands Saba and later also OB and Libresse. So investigating the history of this company adds new geographic and cultural data to the literature on menstrual product technologies and scientific development, while underscoring how much influence stakeholders in the global north continue to hold. Now, in the ads that I wanted to show you, you would have seen some slogans that carried on from the 40s all the way up to the 1990s. And these slogans were "Be free and glad." So I'm translating here from Norwegian. So "Be free and glad, feel on top always, you can be safe." So to indicate that consumers needed to be protected and safe from menstruation through these technologies says a lot about the country's developing attitudes to the menstrual cycle and the related so-called technology fix for its more visible consequences, primarily visible blood. Slogans like these shaped a generation's engagement with the topic of menstruation, and Saba is therefore important to investigate as one of these unique national brands. So for my research project into this, I've drawn on interviews with former staff and factory workers, but also some of the children of the owners of this company, and the extensive and tremendously well-organized Saba archives at Vestfoldarkivet in Sandefjord in Norway, as well as several international corporate menstrual archival materials. My overarching research question to do with all of this is how we got from a homemade pad, mostly knitted by women in Norway in the privacy of their home, sometimes at school, to a consumer product that we still see on the shelves today. Why did this happen in 1940, much later than other Western countries in Norway? And why did consumers so quickly pivot towards buying something for the first time? And this is part of a much larger research project that I've been engaged with the last couple of years, which explores the wider history of this industry, which of course didn't only happen in the Norwegian context, but all across the world at different timescales. And I've explored how this played out both in Britain in the 1980s and also in the last days of the Soviet Union. And the questions that I'm asking is, who made and makes our menstrual products today? How much do we know about this? And how has technology and the science of menstrual product development changed? And what has been the effect, crucially, on workers and consumers in turn? And so the case study today is Scandinavia, but I've also looked at these other regions. Now, in her book about menstrual technologies, the historian of science, Shara Vostrel, writes that tampons and menstrual pads are uniquely gendered technologies that absorb menstrual fluid, but they also have a long history of both use and modification during the 20th century. And she writes that tampons have become and pads have come to belong to a liberation toolbox, providing a means for physical mobility and bodily freedom in a society where menstruation has neither been privileged nor celebrated. What is less recognized, Vostrel carries on, is that women's bodily experiences with tampons and pads are directly linked to development in material science, corporate research, and gynecological observations about menstrual cycles. So Shara Vostrel is one of the first to kind of properly claim these technologies as technologies, and has started this interest in the field of so-called critical menstruation studies, where I include myself, in looking at the history of science and the development of these products as a technology in their own right, not just a symbol of gender or to do with menstruation, but as a technology in their own right. Now, pre-war menstrual habits in Norway as elsewhere were changing, and shift in menstrual technology if we zoom out, went from homemade to machine-made, but there were stages in between this. So evidence of the precise knowledge that women and girls acquire to do this type of work of knitting homemade pads, we have extensive knowledge of this from various ethnological surveys done in Scandinavia from 1900 to 1990. We see a shift in these surveys from girls writing about their menstrual experiences at the early start of the century, a shift from the focus of making products at home in the private family sphere and into the much more public setting of factories, and then finally into shops. But for the user of the object, the opposite trajectory could sometimes be evidenced according to these surveys that I've looked at. So homemade options were made together in groups within the home. So you could think of sisters or mothers and daughters doing this together. Sometimes fathers and sons getting involved as well, or at school, usually segregated, the girls doing this in the sewing class or something like this. Whereas shopping for pads is described by that generation as an overwhelmingly discreet and lonely experience. It's not something that you do with other people. So it becomes private, or just through the parent figure or the carer who is purchasing these items. So in these ads, as I said up top, SABA promised that women could be free and glad and feel on top always, and that they could be safe. But the technological shift from home to factory obviously was not uncomplicated, and it challenged the view of technological development as a process towards more and more progress for people who menstruate. And the notion of safety changes from being something that you have to, the safety of never leaking through your clothes, to a question of safety within the factories that now take on this work. So from the early company history of SABA's competitors, like the American Brown Kotex, we have some insight into the physical labor behind making commercial pads from the 1930s to the 1960s. But this is solely from a corporate perspective. So all of these companies, Procter & Gamble, Essity, famous multinational corporations to this day, have written these histories, but obviously from their own perspective. So we know very little about how these workers felt about their work. And it makes SABA a really unique case because it includes in the archival material that is available at Vestfoldarkivet extensive material from the workers themselves. For example, they had an internal magazine, and there's also meeting minutes from both the union and from the more managerial level. So we have lots of information here about what it's like to make these products for the first generation using disposable products. So Norway is not the first country, as I said, to do this, but it is quick to develop the products through the SABA company, and it works in specific ways in contrast to the US factories. But from the start to end of SABA's era, so 1940 to 1990, the US is seen as the competitor because it has superior technologies. So think of brands today like Kotex and Tampax. I think most of us have heard of these. And they'd also heard about these in Norway in the 1940s. So when the company starts, this is what they're trying to emulate. They're trying to emulate patterns that already exist, and to mimic the American superior quality as the company sees it. And so throughout this period, we have a race to develop the first super absorbent disposable pad, basically a pad that you could wear for maybe up to 6 hours. And then subsequently, the first super absorbent tampon that ideally you could wear all day and even all night. So the whole technological development is already aimed at a goal, and that goal is to develop a fully absorbent product that is easy to use, that is dry and creates a dry experience so that you do not feel blood, and that deals with any issues of smell. So we get a big focus on scent and chemicals in the early days of these companies. It's seen as a worthwhile thing to invest in scientifically and economically because there's so much at stake. A captive, loyal, refreshing, cyclical market, generations upon generations of menstruators growing up every single day. So cracking this market and monopolizing it quickly is the goal. And in terms of SABA itself, it has an interesting origin story that singles it slightly out from the other companies it's competing with. SABA was started in a wooden house, tiny domestic house, just after the end of the occupation of Norway, outside of Tønsberg, which is an industrial city. It was part of, or it saw itself as part of rebuilding the nation after the occupation, and one of several economic success stories that relied heavily on the work of women laborers from this region. It was a self-identified nationalist and Christian business. The origin story that the company founders' children that I've interviewed goes as following. They were walking to church on a Sunday morning, and one of the founders, the three founders, all of them men, sees homemade pads hanging on the washing line out in the sun on this Sunday. He asks his female partner at the time, his girlfriend, what this is. I guess he has a kind of impression that this is something that's interesting enough to ask about. She tells him these are things that women use when they have their periods. And he is shocked, and he has written about how he sees it as uncivilized from the start. An interesting word, I think. He wants to give Norwegian women and girls a more, quote, modern way of coping with this impediment, unquote. And it's not completely unrelated to the post-war period itself, of course, where there's a hunger in Norway for glamour, for style and modernity. This is not the wealthy oil country it becomes much later. This is a poor nation of laborers where most women are working. And so the notion of style, modernity, glamour, disposable culture, anything emulating the luxury of the American technologies is something that the founders think that modern Norwegian women want. And it would seem that they do indeed want this. So from the start, the idea is that this new technology, a disposable menstrual pad and later tampon, will modernize women and by extent feed into the modernization of the Norwegian state post-occupation. So that's their version of the story. But who should make these products and how? This is a taboo topic. Even to this day, some people find it difficult to talk about. And you can imagine in the 1940s, a very Christian, very poor nation like Norway, not a lot of people perhaps signing up to work in these factories. In the beginning, therefore, the recruitment of labor to menstrual companies everywhere is strictly gendered and based around an idea of shift work. So they only hire women in most of the roles. The industry actively fronted the idea that women should be doing this work because pads and tampons were women's business, although this did not translate into the levels of superiors and managers. So as I said, all the founders were male and the managers are entirely male. SABA focused on hiring housewives from the area from 1940 all the way up to 1980. They were seen as labor that was cheap and relatively reliable. As such, the early days of menstrual product making in Scandinavia was dominated by working class women with children or caring responsibilities looking to add income to an already stretched budget. After the 1970s, we see a big shift into immigrant populations into Norway who take on the last remains of the manual labor in these factories before machines overtake the system entirely by 1991. And as I said, this isn't just happening in Norway. Similar origin stories with various tweaks are happening all around the world. The key is to modernize women, to get them out of these uncivilized ways of managing menstruation. And they may well have inspired the SABA founders. Where they got the idea to develop this, no one knows. They, of course, don't want to say that this idea came from the US, for example, but it could have come from a girlfriend or from a partner who utilized these products. This we don't know. They didn't write much about it. So as I said, women were hired because they were women in the UK, in the Soviet Union, in Sweden, in Norway, all around the place. It was viewed as fitting that women did this work because of the taboo and gendered nature of the product. In Sweden, workers for the Mölnlycke company, which would buy SABA in 1990, worked in very similar patterns, and so we know a little bit more about how they physically worked from a Swedish archive I've looked at. Usually, women worked in a row. This would have been slightly easier with images, so forgive me, but imagine a sea of women in a row with one supervisor walking between them. And the supervisors were men. I've not found any female supervisors in any of these companies. The women would manually tie the knots on the side of an older type of pad onto the fabric by hand. So we have a shift in the 1960s where pads become adhesive and you can stick them straight onto your underwear. But before this, you have to tie them onto a kind of garter that you wear around your waist. So a lot of this work is to tie these knots manually by hand. And then you have the supervisors walking behind them, checking in on their work. When the adhesive pads come in, we have the introduction of glue. So the women are painting glue onto the back of the hands. They also have to check for malfunctions and they have to check the quality of the material as they go along. So this is kind of stationary work. You would come in either in the morning shift or in the evening shift. So this is 24 hours and you would stay at the same station for 8 hours with 4 coffee breaks in the case of SABA. So very kind of the same job hour after hour, not a lot of flexibility. And they create, massive amounts of product in this way. So the women are focusing on one job at a time, and the men focus on how all of these jobs hang together in a larger setting. When we get to the 60s, as I said, we have the introduction of adhesive pads and glue. We also see the introduction of more machines. And so with the introduction of more machines that cut the pads through machinery rather than by hand, we see the loss of some jobs. But the supervisors remain, but we have the loss of some of these manual labor jobs. Behind the scenes, we also see an increased investment in scientific research at all of these companies. The international competition is intense, specifically between 1940 to 1980, where we have this single goal for the menstrual habits and experiences of many consumer groups. It should be invisible, it should be scented, soft, absorbent, and ultimately a consumer experience that is discreet and dry. We see this from the technology itself in the pad and how absorption becomes such a huge focus, but also in how the product is sold, advertised, and packaged. So throughout this period, the focus on absorption leads to a lot of building out of laboratories in these companies. And at SABA, it's nothing different. They build a company where they test absorbency with a synthetic vagina, which is called a syngina. Again, you can imagine I have some great photos, but I could circulate them afterwards. And the syngina basically looks like a clear plastic bell, and it's supposed to mimic the pressure and the humidity within the vagina. And so they insert tampons and utilize pads within this structure to see if it can hold the absorption. They use blue saline for this. And this is why we get the blue saline in all the advertising, and why they rely so heavily on this, which is also about advertising censorship, of course. The point that I'm trying to tell you is that no one uses blood, okay? It's way too difficult to source blood, as you can imagine. It's something that the workers feel squeamish about. You're not allowed even to advertise it. So this whole industry revolves around us, almost like a simulacra. They are dedicated to solving the issue of blood, but no one is testing on blood. Today we see some more testing on blood, but this is a development within the last 10 years or so. So the scientific backdrop of the development of the pads and tampons are to some extent slightly artificial. And we see the same in, the development of diapers and other products. I'm not saying it's unique, but it's rather interesting, I think. Now, for the workers, this work is hazardous, and we might consider what workers lost as consumers gained a drier and more absorbent menstrual product experience. First, there was the issue I've already alluded to of sexism and gendered power inequalities, whereby these male managers could learn lots of new skills, they received training, but the women couldn't. They were kind of stuck within the one task they were doing. Then there were the environmental hazards of the factory. The exhaust pipes at SABA were fitted late and poorly, and it resulted in a phenomena called SABA snow. This consisted of the cotton and material bits that floated in and outside of the factory, looking like snow. So you can imagine, outside this factory, it looked like it was snowing. Inside the factory, it looked like it was snowing. People, especially the workers, were breathing this in, and it led to a great degree of respiratory illness. At all the factories, but especially SABA, because it's better documented, but we can perhaps assume that this is happening elsewhere too, there are lists of frequent accidents. So I just selected 2 random years to kind of give you a sense of what was going on, but this is typical. So in over a 2-year period, we have a loss of 5 fingers, we have 20 falls, we have numerous 2nd and 3rd degree burns as the glue is brought in, and we have development of countless respiratory and migraine illnesses to do with the SABA snow. It's so much that they almost can't keep count. Because the work was hard and low paid, people didn't tend to stay long. So once you had an accident, a lot of these people leave, and they simply recruit more of these housewives in the area. There's not a lot of safety training as far as I could see, only at 2 crisis points, which is the toxic shock syndrome scandal in 1979, 1980, and during the HIV pandemic. Were there any workshops in terms of training for the staff? I don't know what they did in these workshops, but I think it's interesting that they kind of just use the workers as bodies in these factories. At SABA, the women did try to unionize. We see this in the 1970s. There was one secretary who was female who sat in with a managerial board. And so it's quite interesting because she keeps the minutes, but she also kind of has commented in the margin, giving her own voice into what she thinks about these minutes, which I think is quite unique and reads sometimes as slightly passive aggressive, but it is, of course, very valuable for anyone looking at this. So repeatedly, she asks if the women workers can have access to training. And many of the women workers want to drive this bus that I described that goes through the fjords and the whole country and sells these products directly to consumers. It was very well paid. And she notes in the margins that the discussion is put on ice again. So as you read this year after year, because she was in the company for 30 years, you get a sense that, yes, you can speak about these things, but they're never resolved. So by the 1980s, we see the women unionizing and organizing for the first time, and effectively being able to ask for better rights. But at that time, a Swedish company buys up the company, and all the workers start losing their jobs at any rate. In the end, I think it brings up the question about whether SABA's promise to revolutionize and modernize life for Norwegian women, how that really kind of played out through the use of these specific technologies, and who benefited from all of this. As I said, this was a success story. It's still held up in Norwegian history books and in financial circles as one of these amazing pioneering stories of Norwegian history. But the focus has been on the founders, these four men who built massive enterprises, and also through their interest in Christian charity, also did a great deal of volunteer work in their own right. But the women themselves and the workers, and perhaps also the consumers, are lost somewhere in this story. Overall, it resulted in success, this business, SABA, in terms of economics. But the question remains as to the larger benefits. Menstruation remained largely invisible and taboo in Norway as elsewhere until activist action began in the late 1980s and today. The historian Anne Kveim Lie documented this longer history of the taboos around menstruation and the consequences of this in Norwegian life. As such, the question of whether SABA helped the cause of menstruation or complicated it in some way is still up for debate. And Norwegian second-wave feminists began arguing as early as the 1970s that the turn towards commercializing the menstrual cycle wasn't entirely negative or positive, but that it was such a big change that it certainly needed to be talked about. They critiqued SABA and analysed SABA in Consumer Report magazines and on the national broadcast television system NRK. So the fronting of the ideal, they argued, of menstruation as dry, discreet, absorbed, clean, invisible, scentless, bloodless, was underpinned by the scientific entrepreneurship of the SABA founders, scientists, and workers. But there's a question as to who it was that claimed that consumers actually wanted these products in the first place. So I want to start kind of summing up, because I know we're a bit over time here. And I guess the kind of conclusions that I can draw from this is that the menstrual product business is a technological history as much as anything else, and that much more attention could be set on it. Much more light could be shone on this factor of the menstrual experience. But it's also intimately tied up with labor history. And these two together, the technological history and the labor history, tells us so much about how these companies that promised to help women actually aided or did not aid their women workers. So all of this, I think, can shed more light on what the legal scholar Bridget Crawford calls menstrual capitalism, this unique ability for companies to carry on capitalizing in various ways on the menstrual cycle. And we have many examples of this. Think of period tracking that happens on anyone's phone today, or new menstrual technologies like the menstrual cup, for example. I'm not saying this is something that belongs to the past, still very much with us. Now, as in many businesses, there are power and gender imbalances that are worth looking at. And I think these environmental hazards and the issue of safety in these factories is interesting, although not unique, of course. And that the labor of menstrual production has been largely overlooked to such a degree that for most people, it's difficult to answer the question of who makes our menstrual cups, our pads, our tampons, our pain medication today. That's still quite difficult to answer in this very moment. So by learning a little bit about this history, it might inspire us to ask questions about the products that are still being developed today. And the final question, of course, is who benefits from this labor and technology history in the past, but also in the present moment. So I think I'm going to end there. I'm sorry I couldn't get you any images. We'll find a way to circulate them the images do bring a lot of color and blood to all of this. So you got a discreet version today, but thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Camilla. That was fantastic. And I don't think you had to worry about it not being interesting without the images. I